Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. This is Justin Pelletier at the Sun Journal, managing editor of Nights and Sports here now. And for 8 years, I was the primary hockey writer here covering the Lewiston Maineiacs of the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League. And 10 years ago, that team did something pretty special here in Lewiston. They won the President's Cup, something no American team had done, and nor has an American team done since, because there are no longer American teams in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League. It was a pretty special time for the hockey community here in Lewiston. And if you think back to how a lot of us watched or listened to those games, especially when they were on the road, a lot of times what we had to do is listen to the radio or watch the web stream. And we're very fortunate today to have one of those people that you probably listened to quite often over those first few years of the Lewiston Maineiacs, Jeff Mannix, one of the radio voices of the Lewiston Maineiacs in the 8-year existence of the team, and the broadcaster who was the guy who called the game that will still live in history here in Lewiston as the championship-winning game. 3 years he called games for the Lewiston Maineiacs. Jeff Mannix, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time and being here.
Thanks, Justin. Happy to be here.
So that game, that team, that season was 10 whole years ago. And you know, some of us had a chance to get back together a little bit about 2 or 3 weeks ago or so and kind of reminisce. But can you really believe it's been 10 years?
I know, it's crazy how fast time goes sometimes. I mean, it seems like it was just yesterday in a lot of cases, and it seems like it was a lifetime ago in a lot of cases too. It was great to catch up with everybody. I hadn't seen some of those people really since that championship, since that moment. So to be able to share in that moment and you know, remember what it was like to be a part of something that was bigger than yourself was just fantastic. And I couldn't have done it with a better group of people. I can't say enough about Clem Jodoin, the head coach and the general manager of that team, and Jeff Gay, the assistant coach, Ed Harding, the associate coach and assistant general manager, everybody right down to Dee Record in the front office, and Mark Goslin, and you know, everybody that was there. I still try to keep in touch with most of them as best I can, and it's, I mean, we're all connected together for life now, and it's a great feeling for sure.
So you were part of that team for 3 full seasons as the radio broadcaster, as the primary radio broadcaster. So you saw this thing kind of build under Clem, under Coach Jodoin, because he came in after the first season was over, and he started to kind of evaluate, and he told me in his interview that, you know, he had to evaluate. He had to sit back a little bit early on and see what he had and figure out what he needed going forward as a general manager and as a coach. And so he did that. And we all got, as observers or members of the team, auxiliary members of the team, a chance to go along for that ride the same amount of time. And you were one of them. You came in basically as a full-time person the same time he did. So you got to see the whole thing. So let's start now with the beginning of that 2006-2007 season. It was Clem's 3rd year here. It was the team's 4th year here. And they had never finished higher than 7th in the standings in the first 3 years that they were here. So was there anything to tip you off at the beginning of that season that said, okay, this is going to be something a little different. This is going to be something special?
I actually, before training camp, I know I was talking to, you know, I would be talking to Clem and talking to people around the team, and I know they felt like they had something special. I know going back to the end of the season, the previous year, they felt like they had a really good core of players, and I thought they did too. It was a young team at that point still, but they had a very good playoff run against a very tough team in Halifax, and they lost in 6 games in the first round, which was a tremendous series. But you could see that the pieces were there. You could see the pieces were there at that point. Another year in expertise, another year in experience, so to speak, in the QMJHL. 1 year is a big difference. So those kids that were 17, 18, or 18 and then 19, that's a big difference. And I felt like a lot of the core that they had there with Marc-Andre Cliche, with Eric Castonguay, guys that had already been there. But at the same time, adding some pieces in that had been draft picks but weren't there yet, like Patrick Cusack coming in, a youngster like Kevin Marshall who was really coming into his own on defense, the return of Pierre-Luc Faubert, who was here in the first year of the team, pre-Clem Jaudoin with Mario Desrochers. But his return to the team as an overage player that year, as an incredibly skilled player. And then the one thing I remember catching my eye during training camp was this 18-year-old kid from Sherbrooke who had been drafted in the 6th round, who had lit up midget AAA the year before. I'm talking about David Perron, who, of course, went on to, he's still playing in the National Hockey League now, but was drafted in the 1st round of the NHL draft by St. Louis the following year, ended up making their team the following year as a 19-year-old. But he had so much skill and ability. He jumped right out at you from the first minute I saw him on the ice. And then seeing Jonathan Bernier as well, and knowing the caliber of goaltender that he was, and the youngster Peter Delmas as well, who was a pretty darn good QMJHL goaltender in his own right as well, coming in, and it just seemed like there was something special in training camp.
And Peter forced their hand. They had Travis Fullerton still on the roster, and they traded Travis Fullerton after they saw Peter Delmas play.
That's right.
They had a bona fide backup.
Yes, they did.
To Jonathan Bernier, and they traded Travis Fullerton away.
Yes, they did.
So
that's right.
It's one of those things where they had a lot of confidence in the youth. I looked at a lot of this stuff, Jeff, and the youth on this team. Most teams win with 9, 10, 11, 19-year-olds plus your allotted 3 20-year-olds. Mm-hmm. This team won with 7 19-year-olds on this team and 3 20-year-olds. 10. So of the 24 players who actually played in a game that season, fewer than half were 19 years old or 20 years old. So they were still young to be making this run, but you could see the talent. And I think the other thing that Clem continued to bring up was the chemistry.
Right.
And they worked hard at that from the moment he stepped foot in here in 2004, 2005 to build the culture so that by 2006, 2007, the chemistry was there.
Yeah. And that group, especially that group, was a family. I mean, in the biggest sense of the word. You could see it whenever they were all together. And, of course, when you're on the road as much as I was with the team, I mean, there were times when we'd be away for almost 2 weeks at a time. So you would see so often everybody together. Not just, disparate groups of guys kind of all in their own thing, but in many cases, they would be out together as a team on the road. Everybody. They wouldn't exclude anyone. Everyone would be out together, and that was one thing that I think Clem put together very well. I think he did a good job of finding the right pieces, and he certainly added a few before the season started that I think added to that chemistry in a couple of the 20-year-olds, and Sebastian Courcelle and Tristan Manson, who were perfect fits here. They were natural leaders, and they were guys who would come out to the rink and work every single day to make sure everybody on the team was better, especially Courcelle. I remember Clem referring to him as a coach on the ice. And I'm kind of surprised he hasn't found his way into coaching personally, but maybe that's something that he'll do in his future, because I think he has a great hockey mind, and I think he's got a great passion for the sport.
Sure. Well, with Simone, he left when he left here and went to McGill. He won basically the Rookie of the Year in the entire CIS, the Canadian University System, the following year at McGill, and then he stopped playing.
Yeah,
he was the best player as a rookie in the university system in Canada, and he stopped playing, and now he's a firefighter.
Yeah,
to me, does that surprise you at all that he's in a public service that is for the betterment of other people. It
Not
doesn't
at all.
surprise me one
Not
bit.
at all. Not at all. Knowing Simone, he was one of the unique guys of that team for me because he was a young man who was mature beyond his age. You could tell he thought much bigger than what was right in front of him. He thought locally and he thought globally. So knowing that he is a firefighter and doing things to give back to his community, that is not a surprise in essence. And I think Simone, and I misspoke his name, is Sebastian, his older brother, who also played in the QMJHL earlier. But Simone, that doesn't surprise me in the least that he's gone on to do the amazing things that he has. And we mentioned Tristan Manson too. He's now in the Canadian Navy / Coast Guard. So, same thing. Again,
Sure.
A guy who's out there who's, giving of himself to his community and to his country, and that's great.
So let's get into recapping this glorious season. We're going to try to go not game by game because, let's face it, they played 90 games that year. If you count the playoffs and the Memorial Cup.
91, actually.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So, I mean, that's a crazy amount of games. We're not going to go through each one, but we can take them in blocks, right?
Sure.
I mean, we can take them in blocks. And in the QMJHL, they like to say Christmas is halfway. The holiday break is halfway. They like to measure you at the quarter pole. And maybe after your first 10 games and in your last 10 games, because that's just a nice even round number of 10. A lot of people love those even numbers. So let's start with their first 12. Okay, because that's an easy one to do. Through 12 games, Mark Andre. Speaking of calling people by their brother's name, Jonathan Bernier, and not Marc Andre Bernier, also an older brother who played in the Q.
Yep.
Started of the first 12 games, 10 of the first 12. And they played well, but they weren't lighting the world on fire. They had 3 losses in those first 12 games. And a lot of the hype before the season, they were 4-2 in the first 6, 4-2 in the first 6, and then 4-1-1 in the next 6. They weren't lighting the world on fire, and for a team that was supposed to be going for it, or at least to the fans' perspective, it was a little bit of a slow start. They did start the entirety on the road, as they always did.
Yes.
Because they played the first part of the season on the road because of the visa issue here in Lewiston. But from what you remember, that first part of the season, getting their feet wet, getting things to start clicking with each other, getting the lines set up. I think by the end of that 12 games, I think they had their lines that they used for the rest of the season by that point.
Yeah, they had them pretty close from what I remember, and I haven't looked at them in a while, but I kept the notes and everything that I've had from that season, including line charts from every single game. So that's something I haven't done lately, but now I'm probably going to go home and start looking at all this stuff. But yeah, chances are certainly a lot of the combinations that you saw down the stretch certainly were formed, right around that 12 to 15 game mark for sure. You didn't see a whole lot of juggling after that, other than things like injuries and whatnot.
So they go 8-3-1. Then they hit a couple of games against Moncton. When I say Moncton that year, what comes to your mind? Because I know what comes to my mind for that year with Moncton. They played them 6 times.
Yep.
What comes to your mind when I say the name Moncton, especially with regard to that team that year?
Lewiston's kryptonite is what comes to mind when I say Moncton. And it was interesting, too, because, of course, the year before, Moncton had won the President's Cup. They hosted the Memorial Cup, and they were in the Memorial Cup final. They were one of the best teams in all of Major Junior Hockey that year. And the year before, Lewiston beat them practically any time they played. It was kind of interesting in that respect, and it was always fun to see Lewiston be able to compete with a team like that. The following year in 06-07, the script flipped. Lewiston was the elite team, the team that was going to be going after a championship, and Moncton was a little bit of a middle-of-the-road kind of a team that year, still good, but they'd lost pieces and they weren't as good as they were the year before. But that Moncton team just no matter where it was, whether it was at the Androscoggin Bank Coliseum or up at the Moncton Coliseum, they gave the Maniacs fits. And no matter how well Lewiston was playing, Moncton was going to give them their best game, and usually it seemed like came out the victor. I mean, I remember so many close games that year with the Moncton Wildcats that went the way of Moncton.
Moncton won 3 shootouts against Lewiston that year.
Yep.
And of note, on that Moncton team that beat Lewiston was Jerome Samson, who had yet to be traded to Val-d'Or for what we'll talk about in a little while.
Right.
So it's kind of funny. And, of course, noted Maniac killer Matt Marquardt.
Yes.
Who was a bane in a lot of fans' existences because of how good he was, particularly against the Maniacs. He wasn't overly flashy, but he was big, and he was skilled, and he did a great job against the Maniacs. So one of those games that I noted here in the recap that you can read elsewhere here online here at sunjournal.com is again, 9-8 game
Yep.
in Moncton.
Yep.
Where they were coming off the Rock. They had just played in St. John's.
Yep.
The Maniacs had just played in St. John's. And Marc-Andre LaBelle put the Wildcats on top 7-6 with 5 minutes to play in the game.
Yep.
And then Cliche tied the game with 2:29 to play. David Perron put the Maniacs ahead with 1:40 to play. And then Matt Marquardt scored with 30 seconds to play to force a shootout, or force overtime, which, of course, then went to a shootout. And Jerome Samson scored the shootout winner. Just kind of encapsulated that for that first part of the season for the Maniacs with respect to Moncton. And, of course, the next night they come back, and they're just absolutely gassed. And they still had to play in the Maritimes. They went to Halifax. Mm-hmm. And they played Halifax, and they got shellacked. Peter Delmas took his first loss of the season as a 16-year-old in his hometown. Feel bad for him at the time. It was 3-1. It wasn't a shellacking per se, but the shots and everything was shellacking.
Oh, yeah. No, Halifax controlled that game without a doubt.
That was a turning point. After that game, the Lewiston Maineiacs didn't lose again for 13 games.
Right.
That win streak right there, was that the point where you said we're an elite team?
It was one of them. I mean, it was clear by that point that they were very, very good. You don't win 13 games in a row in the QMJHL without being a very good hockey team. I wasn't sure at that point if they were championship level. I knew they were really, really good. And that 13-game winning streak was amazing, and so was that 9-8 game. It's still the highest scoring hockey game I've ever broadcast. It was incredibly back and forth. In some ways, it was a great game. In some ways, it was a really ugly game. It was just kind of, really, really interesting the way that game played out with kind of both teams going ahead at certain points. And, you thought that Perron goal was going to finish it off because, I mean, this is the Maniacs. They're going to finish that game off. And then Matt Marquardt completed a hat trick. I think there was a hat trick on both sides that game. And, but after that Halifax game, they went on the long run. And they really put the wood to some teams during that game, during that stretch. So, yes, it was clear they were really good, but there was a point later on in the season that I think we'll talk about probably a little bit later on here in the interview where I really knew that they were primed and probably a championship team.
So after that streak, their streak ends, not their point streak, but their winning streak, because they lost again in a shootout to Moncton.
Yes. When
Matt Marquardt scored an important goal again for the Wildcats. But then the night after that, they actually lost.
Yep.
Lost.
Yes.
That was right at the start of Clem Jaudoin's trip to the World Juniors.
Yes, it was.
Jonathan Bernier stayed for an extra couple of games before he also joined the World Junior squad, but Clem left early to go join the coaching staff, and then Bernier and Marc-Andre Cliche then went with the players and joined them. So for the month of December and into early January, the team was not only missing its head coach and general manager, but also its all-star goaltender and its captain.
Right.
And didn't fare too badly despite that. And I think that's a testament to how the team was built from a depth perspective. You took away your number one center and your number one penalty killer, and you took away your number one goaltender, and yet the team continued to win. Not at the same clip. It wasn't 13 in a row again, but they continued to win, right? I mean, you look at this, when you got into games, up to game 43, 44, 45, they're still sitting at 32-9,
right,
with 3 shootout losses. So they were that was their second trip to Newfoundland at that point.
Yep.
And that was the first games back for the triumvirate that had gone on to win gold at the World Juniors that year. And they went to the Rock. And at that point, now you've got the team back together again, but you're coming off of a break. You're coming off of it took a little bit of time at that point to regain that footing that they'd had previous, did it not?
Yes, it did. And that trip to St. John's was a little rocky, no pun intended. There was a game, if I remember it right, where they had a 3-goal lead in the third period and coughed it up.
Yep.
Lost in regulation 4-3. And I remember reading a lot of comments and stuff from back here that it was kind of panic time a little bit for some of the fans.
Which is hard to say because they still haven't lost. We're 44 games into the season, and they've only lost 9 games.
Right. But, and I understand it from a fan perspective, if this team is going to win a championship, they need to beat everybody. And the St. John's Fog Devils weren't very good that year. So, they had some really good talent on the team, but they weren't a very good hockey team. So to lose, in essence, in the last 20 minutes of a game that you had pretty much dominated for the first 40 minutes certainly looks like alarm bells. But in junior hockey especially, you find that momentum doesn't necessarily always carry over, especially if it's negative momentum from game to game, and they recovered from that pretty quickly. The next game, they had a tremendous game, I remember, up in St. John's, and that was the last game of that series. And from there, it started to click the way it had before.
Almost. Because the next set of because that was a long road trip.
That's right.
And so instead of flying home from St. John's, you all went to Halifax.
That's right.
The next 3 games, I've dubbed the Maritime Massacre.
And that with good reason.
and for very good reason.
Yes.
I'm
forgot
just
that was all on the same trip.
It was absolutely on the same trip, and we'll talk a little bit about this right now because it was particularly worrisome because you saw a flurry of scoring in the second period. The teams combined for 4 goals in the first 6 minutes, and the Mooseheads took a 4-2 lead. Maineiacs battled back, made it 4-4. Jonathan Bernier, well, first of all, they pulled Jonathan Bernier from that game.
Right.
Because he just was not having a good game.
No, he was not.
So they put in Peter Delmas. They come back to tie it 4-4. Delmas goes down with an injury. So now you have to put Bernier back in.
Mm-hmm.
Bernier goes down with an injury.
Yep.
Now it's a matter of which goaltender is less hurt. So they put Delmas back in at the end of that game because he was less hurt than Jonathan Bernier was.
Yes.
And as a collective group, the Lewiston Maineiacs are about to pass out because all of a sudden, not only is their ticket to a possible championship in net, Jonathan Bernier, a future NHL star, down, but your rookie phenom is also down with an injury. And I know there was a lot of frantic phone calls on the bus.
I remember it.
Between Halifax and Antigonish. And then at Antigonish, there was a lot of likely anyway, a lot of nursing of wounds going on in the hotel, trying to get ready for the 2 games in Cape Breton the following 2 nights. It was a 3-3.
Right.
And so they had to figure out, A, who was going to back up who was going to play, and where they were going to get another goaltender.
Right.
And it was just an incredible, and so you go into Cape Breton. Delmas starts both games.
Yes, he does.
Because Jonathan Bernier is unable to go.
While about probably, I'm going to guess, 75%.
Maybe.
If he was lucky.
Right, exactly. And Marc-Andre Sauvé, who never actually got into a game for the Lewiston Maineiacs, but was the backup for that swing, served as the backup. But they dropped both games.
Right, who they had to fly in, by the way, under crazy circumstances. Somebody had to drive to Halifax to get him from the airport, to get him to Sydney in time. That is not an easy drive. That is a long drive for sure. And at the same time, too, that first game, there was a huge blizzard that was hitting Sydney, Nova Scotia at the time, too. There was questions whether the game was even going to get played because they were talking about, feet of snow that was going to start falling at around 4 o'clock local time with a 7 o'clock local time start. So they ended up playing the game, both games, obviously. The bus got stuck in the parking lot after that first game. Everybody had to walk back to the hotel 2 blocks in the middle of driving snow, driving wind. It's an island, remember, so it gets kind of crazy. But yeah, and on the ice, especially that first game, I think things went about as well as could be expected under the circumstances. They had a shot to win that game. It was a 2-1 score. Delmas was incredibly good for how injured he was. And were it not for some, I don't know, I'd say maybe dubious post-drop kicks by Andrei Pavlik, maybe Lewiston would have had a better fate in that game.
He was pretty good at that.
Yes.
Still is.
Still is.
So, all right. So now you lose 3 games, 1 in a shootout to Halifax and then 2 to Cape Breton. All of a sudden now you're sitting there with 14 losses.
Mm-hmm. And Cape Breton at the same time is breathing right down Lewiston's neck
100%.
in the standings. So that was a huge series, and I know a lot of Screaming Eagle fans got excited by those results because, see, we're better than Lewiston. We're better than Lewiston. If we face them in the playoffs, we're going to beat them. We're better than Lewiston.
And I misspoke. That was 11 losses to that point.
Right.
So now you're in game 51 of the season out of 70. You've got 20 games left, and you have no Jonathan Bernier, and you've got a Peter Delmas that's actually, to be fair, was never 100% again.
Right.
Until he got to professional hockey. Throughout his entire junior career, he was never operating at 100% because he played through pain that he's since said, I probably shouldn't have played through just so I could play. So, but that was Peter trying to do everything for the team that he could. I mean, that's just how he operated, and that's how a lot of these guys operated. But unfortunately, in the long run, it was to his detriment. Mm-hmm. In the short term, though, he rattles off 15 wins against 3 losses and ties the QMJHL rookie record at the time for wins by a 16-year-old in a season. Ties it.
Yep.
With 2 games left in the season. And then here comes Jonathan Bernier back from his high ankle sprain.
Right.
And he could have set a record. And he went to the coaching staff, or the coaching staff went to him and said, look, we've got to get Jonathan ready for the playoffs. Mm-hmm. And Peter says, I don't care about a record. I care about a title.
Right.
And that's the kind of kids that they had on this team. But that shows you the mentality as they went down the stretch run. And so, yeah, he lost 3 of those 18 games that he played. But at one point, they stopped losing. Mm-hmm. With 10 games left in the regular season, they stopped losing.
Yep.
They won their last 10 games of the regular season, including winning the Jean Rougeau Trophy on home ice in the last possible home game of the season, which was huge, the regular season championship, in their wonderful gray jerseys.
Yes.
Which, at least from a broadcast standpoint, you could see the blue on gray.
I could.
At least you could see the numbers, and it wasn't as horrible as, say, a light yellow on a dark yellow or a green on green or something like that. You could see them, but we digress here. But that last 10 games of the season, is that when you say, all right, we got this?
There was a stretch, I think, within that last 10. The stretch that it became obvious to me was a 3-game in 3-day trip to Western Quebec. Gatineau, Rouyn-Noranda, Val-d'Or. And they won all 3 of those games. And all 3 of those teams were good, obviously. Gatineau,
they're always
an elite team in the QMJHL under Benoit Gru, who's now in the American Hockey League. as a coach. You've got Rowan Naranda, who ended up making it to the semifinals. That was Lewiston's semifinal opponent in the President's Cup playoffs. And Valdor, the team he played in the final. So that you knew going into it was going to be an incredibly tough stretch of games and incredibly hard to get points from, let alone win games. They went in, they won all three. And the one in Valdor was especially sweet, I think, for everybody because it was the end of the trip. That Valdor team, it was post-trade deadline, so that team was loaded up. It was the team that they played in the final. It was, Brad Marchand was there. Samson, as you mentioned, Jerome Samson was there. Chris Letang was there. Jeremy Duchesne was their goaltender, who at the time was one of the best in the league. So when they went into Valdor, especially in that game, and they got outplayed for good portions of that game, but a goal it was, I think, 55 seconds to go by Simone Courcelle finished the game off, and they ended up winning. And I remember on air, I remember feeling the excitement when that goal went in. I remember seeing it from the bench below me, how excited that team was when that goal went in and when they took the lead in that game, because they never gave up on it, because they'd been outplayed. And I think you ask anybody on that team that night, they were outplayed, and they still found a way. And I remember right then and there thinking to myself, and I remember on the bus right after the game thinking to myself, they're going to win the championship this year. And I had no doubt in my mind after that moment.
That game was almost to them, to the Maniacs, like the games Cape Breton won against Lewiston would have been had Cape Breton defeated Valdor and played Lewiston in the final. There was that confidence.
That's right.
It was that confidence builder eyeing the future.
Right.
Because if Cape Breton beats Valdor, and we'll talk about this in a minute here, but if Cape Breton beats Valdor in that semifinal series on the other side, their last memory of Lewiston is sweeping them. Mm-hmm. Right? So and so for Lewiston, when they eventually saw Valdor again, their last memory was of defeating Valdor, taking what they could throw at you and beating them. And so you're right. I think that was a big piece. So we head into the playoffs, Jeff.
Yes.
We head into the playoffs, and old friends Shawinigan
yes.
greet us in the first round. I believe that was the second time in 4 years.
Correct.
And ended up being
second in 3 years.
Second in 3 years.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And was, I think, 4 out of the 8 years they played them in the playoffs somewhere.
Right.
Over the 8 years. So it was a familiar playoff opponent, and as I noted in the notes again that you can read here on sunjournal.com as part of this whole package, is 4 was the magic number. 4 was basically the magic number for the Maniacs across the board. If you could score 4 goals, you were confident that Jonathan Bernier and Peter Delmas, either or, would not let in 4 goals.
Right.
4 was the magic number. Mm-hmm. No, so not only was it 4-0 because the Maniacs swept that playoff series, but they scored 4 goals
every single
at
game.
Least in each single game.
Yeah.
And that was the magic number. That's what you had to get to. And you had guys, it was spreading around the scoring. It wasn't David Perron leading the team in scoring, which he ultimately did, of course. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't just him. Eric Castonguay was scoring. Pierre-Luc Faubert was scoring. Marc-Andre Clich was scoring. Simon Courcelle was scoring. Chris Tutalo came up huge in the playoffs, a couple of game-winning goals. Chad Denny was a man among boys from the point, particularly in that first-round series. That sends a statement, right? That's we're not here to mess around. Yes, it's a 1/16, or actually it was a conference until the semifinals where things crossed
over, right?
But point is, they sent a message.
Yes, they
did.
that
series that they were not going to lay down, and they were going to score a ton of goals.
Yep, and I think the first game especially was basically a tone-setting game for them, because they outplayed Shawinigan, I would say, for the most part in that first game, but they found themselves trailing most of it. And, down 3-0 at one point. Or no, 2-0. Sorry, 2-0 at one point. And David Perron scored with 1 second left.
In 3 in a row.
The second period, and then ended up with a natural hat trick, scoring a 5-on-3 power play goal with, I think, was it under 2 minutes to go? Mm-hmm. And then the next one about 35 seconds later in the 5-on-4 to complete a natural hat trick and win the game. That, to me, was a huge statement game because they were behind most of it. In playoff hockey, as we all know, sometimes you can outplay the opponent. You face a hot goaltender, which Shawinigan had at that point, in Kevin Mileto. And sometimes things don't go your way, and it can snowball really fast. But, again, they never gave up. They just kept chugging along. Just keep doing your game plan, and they're going to get it. Things are going to turn out okay, and they did. And they won that game, and similar circumstances in Game 2. You go to Shawinigan with the lead, and again in the fourth game they had to come from behind late to force the overtime, and then Chris Tutalo scored the overtime game winner after Stefano Gigliotti showed off his nothing other than his tremendous speed by splitting the defense, just going hard up the middle and beating their guys to the net.
So they win against Shawinigan in 4 games. Now they get a few days off to wait and rest. And now they get Halifax.
Right.
Nemesis Halifax. Halifax that knocked them out of the playoffs the year before, that knocked them off their game so badly that you had guys suspended at the end of the previous season, or would have had they been coming back to the league, I think, anyway. But that was never completed. But point is, it's Halifax.
Yes.
Now, they offloaded a little bit because they were trying to rebuild a little bit. So the goaltender that ultimately faced Lewiston in the final wasn't there anymore.
Right.
But it was still Halifax, and they still had some good players. One named Voracek.
Yeah. Yep.
But the name that causes the most consternation among anybody in Maniacs Nation still to this day is Ryan Hillier.
Right.
They seemed in command over the first couple of games of that series. At home, of course. Mm-hmm. They were fine. They scored the most goals of any of their 4 series in the playoffs in that series. Their offense was working fine. Mm-hmm. But they had a couple of defensive lapses in that series. Luckily for them, the first 3 games they were able to overcome those.
Yes.
Not in Game 4.
Not in Game 4. And the overtime game winner by Hillier was a classic defensive breakdown, too, because he was allowed basically to carry the puck from the right corner. I remember he swooped around the right circle, back to the blue line, the middle of the blue line, right to the hash marks, basically, in between the circles, and it was allowed to rip a shot. Ryan Hillier at that point wasn't going to miss.
Sure.
If he's allowed that much open space, and he was allowed tons of open space, and that was obviously the one game that Lewiston lost during those playoffs, but it was certainly a wake-up call at that point, I think, to everybody, and you could tell the next day because there was a day off between Game 4 and Game 5. And I remember from that game as well, about maybe 2 or 3 minutes before Hillier scored the goal, David Perron had a wide-open chance to finish it off and end the series from good 8 feet away from the net probably, and he missed. And I remember the next day was, one of those optional, practices, don't go on the ice really, but do active stretching, as Clem Jaudoin called it, which usually meant playing volleyball. And in my case,
Get
being
hit by the
spiked
volleyball.
in the face, thanks to Jacob Bundle. But David Perron, I remember, went out on the ice in his tracksuit and in his sneakers with his stick. He went to the exact spot where he missed and just kept taking shots for 30 minutes. He didn't stop. That told me a lot about him, and that told me a lot about what the team was thinking about. They were thinking about missed opportunities, not about the mistakes they'd made. They knew they needed to clean those up. But you don't do that sort of thing without having the mindset of, we're better than this team. We need to execute on our end, and we'll finish this off.
And part of that, too, was kind of sympathy is probably the wrong word, but they just allowed Jonathan Bernier to his 55 shots in a game.
Yes.
And that's to his 52 saves were the franchise record in the playoffs for the entire existence of the franchise. That was the single most shots a Lewiston goaltender faced in the playoffs. Despite those drubbings that they took a few years later, Drummondville never took that many shots on Adrian LeMay those couple of years later.
Wow.
That was the single most shots that a Lewiston goaltender faced. So, there's that. But still, they were leading that game until PJ Corsi scored with like 2 minutes left in the game, too. So you knew they were. And then the next night, they come out like gangbusters and just destroy them.
Right.
I mean, it was 3-0 before you could blink, and it ended up being a 5-1 game. Everybody goes back home happy. And now you're sitting and waiting for Rouen-Noranda to be ready at the end of their next playoff because they went 6 games or 7 games. In their previous. So you're sitting at home waiting again. So there was travel involved. Halifax is 10 hours away, 9.5 hours away. Rouen-Noranda is 12.5 hours away. Val-d'Or is 11 hours away. But you had the time in between, and everybody was coming to you to start. So it seems you look at it and say, oh, God, could they have played anybody further away from them? No. But everybody had to come to Lewiston because of the regular season trophy and the regular season championship, and that was a big deal.
Exactly. I think home ice advantage was a huge deal for this team, and they played extremely well at Androscoggin Bank Coliseum. The building was loud. I mean, I've never heard it louder probably than Game 2 of the final, which we'll get to probably in a little bit. But yes, having home ice advantage I think was huge for this team, and they deserved to have the home ice advantage without a doubt. They were the best team all season. Against
Noranda, I mean, it's another sweep. I mean, we could keep talking about this all day, but let's be real. They came out like gangbusters. They held Rouen-Noranda to 17 total shots in the first game, in a playoff game between two teams that are theoretically two of the best 4 teams remaining in the league. And one can make a case that Noranda was among the top 6 anyway. So they certainly were a top echelon team. 17 shots in a playoff game is pretty good accomplishment for a defensive unit to hold an opponent to. They win the first 2 at home. Then you have to go to Noranda. Now, I remember the rink at Noranda is small.
Yes.
It is to the QMJHL what Boston Garden used to be to the NHL.
Yes.
In terms of size. So that didn't, for a team that relied on its speed and its technical skill that like Lewiston did, or at least its top couple of lines did, that should have favored Noranda.
Should have.
But it didn't.
No.
They didn't take advantage of that, at least in the Game 3. In Game 4, they tried.
Yep.
And ended up going to the penalty box all game because they were trying.
Right.
So it turned into another sweep. It shouldn't have been that easy.
No, it shouldn't have been. I think ultimately in that series, a lot of what you saw with Rouen-Noranda was I think they'd emptied the tank in the previous round to go 7 games with Drummondville, who was a team that a lot of people thought could win the championship that year. They were a loaded team. They had Guillaume Letendresse at that point. They had Derek Brassard, who's still playing in the NHL, quite an important role with the Ottawa Senators, still playing right now. So I think they kind of emptied. I think Rouen was a young team that year. They ended up getting to the President's Cup final the next year, but they were still, I think, not quite at the level they needed to be to compete with Lewiston in that series. Now, they still did. They played a lot better in their own rink than they did in Lewiston, but it was clear the better team was Lewiston in that case. Although, again, like I said, you could see Rouen-Noranda was on the rise without a doubt.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the bracket, Cape Breton takes a 3-1 series lead against Val-d'Or. Everybody in Lewiston is plotting at that point because they're like, "Whoa, Cape Breton is on fire." They have had Lewiston's number for the most part this season, of course under extenuating circumstances, but they did. They won. They won the season series from the Maineiacs that season during the regular season. So all of a sudden, little Val-d'Or with Marchand, with Letang, with Matthew Roy, who never really did much. It's a different Matthew Roy than did something in the NHL. It's the other Matthew Roy. But at the time, he was their leading scorer that year. Yeah. He was a great player. They had Duchesne, and Dorso was no slouch as a backup. But beyond that, their depth, they had added Samson during the season as well out of Moncton. But their depth wasn't, I mean, Cape Breton was clearly, to many people, a better team that year. And yet here comes Val-d'Or. They win Game 5 on the road to force 6 and 7, which were back home.
Right.
They go back home. They win Game 6 in overtime.
Yep.
To force a Game 7, and then they win Game 7.
Coming
Meanwhile,
from behind in the third period as
right,
well.
Right. And now they've got to come to Lewiston.
Yep.
Speaking of gassed,
Yes.
that first game showed it. You
Oh,
go
yeah.
to the first game of that championship series, they only took 18 shots on goal.
Yeah, and they were
And none of them went in.
No, they were thoroughly beaten from the start. I mean, you could tell from the opening face-off that Lewiston was going to be the better team that night, and Tristan Manson scored a goal, for goodness sake. He never scored practically.
Sure.
But it was a great game all around by Lewiston. They were the rested team, and Valdor, would need an extra day, but boy, did they come back in game 2. That's for sure.
Well, and that's where I was going next. They outshot Lewiston in game 2, 33-23. They had a 9 power plays advantage to 5. Lewiston had to get a goal in the last minute of regulation to win the game. Mm-hmm. Valdor, by all rights, should probably have won game 2.
Probably.
During that whole run through the playoffs, they go 16-1 in the playoffs overall. Is that where you say this is just destiny?
Yes, without a doubt. That score was 3-3. They ended up with the power play late, which was a little surprising because the officiating seemed to be going in Valdor's favor that night. But the penalty that was called was correct. It absolutely was a penalty, and the play that ended up with the game-winning goal was pretty neat. I mean, it's Chad Denny wiring a slapper from the right point that just happens to deflect off the arm of Pierre-Luc Faubert in front of the net and redirect in front of Duchesne and go in. And I remember they reviewed it for a long time to make sure that there wasn't anything intentional, and they decided it was a goal. I remember seeing I remember the play very, very well in my head still, and knowing at the time that the goal was going to stand, and why are they taking so long, and then just hearing the building explode when they said it was a good goal and they allowed it to stand. It was amazing to watch that. And I had a feeling too, with the 2-3-2 format, the series probably wasn't coming back to Lewiston.
So you go game 3 and you go to Valdor. And in a game that you think Valdor's going to throw everything they've got at Lewiston, it's their home. Mm-hmm. They've got to take a stand at this point. They don't.
Right.
Yes, Lewiston had to come from behind and score a goal late to win. But Lewiston was never really out of that game.
No, they weren't. It was a little bit kind of flukish that they were behind, I think, in that game. Valdor scored a couple lucky goals that Bernier, I don't necessarily think Bernier wanted to have them back, so to speak, but it was just kind of lucky bounces, just kind of odd things that happen that sometimes happen in hockey games. But Lewiston, again, it's a 60-minute game, and they just kept pushing, and eventually you knew that if things went right, something was going to go in.
And it was an anomaly of a game, too, because there were only 5 total penalties called the entire game.
No kidding. Yeah.
Of the other games, one way or the other, there was usually between 12 and 15 penalties being called in these games. Mm-hmm. 12 and 15 power plays in one direction or the other. Talk about officials taking control of a game. But in this game, there was 5 total. 2 on one side, 3 on the other. They let them play.
Yeah.
And that actually played to Lewiston's strengths, because 5-on-5, they were the better team all the way across the board.
Absolutely, it did, and they just kept pushing, and yeah, it was in order: Marc-Andre Cliche, Chad Denny, Pierre-Luc Faubert that scored third period goals, mm-hmm. which of course the first 3 guys the Maineiacs ever drafted, so it just seemed to kind of fit.
The fourth game, you think, okay, Valdor's up against the wall, they're at home, they don't want to even be embarrassed, they don't want to get swept. Maybe they can extend it to a 5th game. Mm-hmm. They need to throw everything in the kitchen sink at the Maineiacs. And for 2 periods, they didn't at all.
Right.
Lewiston dominated that game and was somehow not able to extend their lead beyond what they had. They were, for the first 13 minutes of the game, it was an even game. Mm-hmm. David Perron pops in 2 really quick ones in the first period.
Yep.
To make it 2-0. They were, at the time, once the second period was over, Lewiston had 6 power plays in that game to that point. Mm-hmm. And had not scored on any of them, right, except for the one to David Perron score. So I scored on 1. I'm sorry,
right,
1 out of 6.
Right.
And it was one of 5 at that point. They got another one early in the third
Yes.
to make it 1 for 6.
Right.
All those chances to bury the series after all the goals they'd scored all season, after the times that they'd put teams away, and they didn't do it. And you've got to be thinking, uh-oh, has the magic run out? Or maybe not magic run out, but that's probably too strong. But is this finally the time where they just don't hang on, that there's a blow to the confidence? Mm-hmm. Because they're not finishing. You could tell early on, before the third period got all hectic, something was off a little bit early in that game, that it wasn't, I don't know, it just seemed to me that they weren't scoring. They weren't putting it away. There was reason to worry at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly get where you're coming from with that. And yeah, they didn't finish off some of the chances we'd seen them finish off, without a doubt. They did kind of let Valdor back into the game, and Valdor had a great push in that third period. Don't take any credit from
100%.
them. They absolutely pushed really hard, and if that was there the entire series, maybe we're talking a different result, but it wasn't. And Bernier needed to stand tall in that 20-minute stretch, and he did. He gave up the 1 goal, but that was almost even a little. I mean, it was a play where he wasn't going to be able to do anything about it. But everything else that he had the opportunity to see, even plays he didn't have the opportunity to see, he was making. Right. And that's, in large part a lot to credit to the defense that was in front of him, especially Patrick Cusack and Marc-Andre Krejt, who I remember were playing an awful lot of penalty kill time down the stretch of that game. And Tom Mahalik a little bit too, I think, was in that game as well. But certainly those two, Krejt and Cusack, were playing big minutes for young guys, right. Young inexperienced guys, right. Down the stretch of that game, because they had to. And I mean, they got the job done. Clem trusted them for a reason. That
defensive unit only had one 19-year-old on it,
right?
And Chad Denny. Two with Misho Karenko. I apologize.
Yes,
the top pairing of Misho Karenko and Chad Denny. But then you had an 18-year-old Marshall.
Yep.
And then 17-year-olds Ward and Cusack and Krejt.
Right.
I mean, you didn't have the wealth of experience like we talked about earlier on that defensive unit. And then you also had Simon Courcelles sacrificing his body to block shots.
Yes.
Marc-Andre Klisch sacrificing his body to block shots. And they all did.
Yes, they did.
But ultimately, the final shots were 42-24 because the shots in the final period were 20-2.
Yes.
In favor of Valdor.
Yep.
And yet, Lewiston pulled it out. I remember seeing from my position in the press box, which is not too far from yours.
Right.
Mark Just's head continued to poke out. Mr. Just, the owner of the Maineiacs, spent the entire third period in the locker room.
Yes, he did.
Sebastian Piché, who was not playing that night because he was hurt,
yep,
was running back and forth from the arena to the locker room, giving him updates as the game wore on. And finally, with about 30 seconds left, Piché finally convinced Mr. Just to come out to near the bench. He said, "Don't worry, Mr. Just, we've got it. Bernier is standing on his head." Mm-hmm. And it was that confidence they had in that goaltender, and they did it. I mean, they did it. From a broadcasting standpoint, calling that last 10 seconds, take me through that.
I remember that Valdor basically had one last shot to really do something after Lewiston had cleared the puck. They'd pulled the goaltender by this point, so they had an extra attacker on. I remember they rimmed it around the boards with about 10 seconds left. Marc-Andre Klisch cut it off in the right corner. I'm viewing it to my right, the corner in my right, the near corner. I remember with 6 seconds to go, Marc-Andre Klisch cut it off and just pinned it in his skates. Valdor tried as best they could to try and rip it free. They couldn't. And I remember with about 1 second left, the Valdor players, just both of them that were whacking at the puck, just kind of both stopped because they knew. They knew they weren't going to get it out, and they knew they'd lost. And it was pretty amazing. It was wonderful to call and to see that jubilation from that team that had been together all year. Remember, they made no trades at the trade deadline in the QMJHL, which is unheard of.
I still don't think a team has done that since either.
Right. So this was a team that was together pretty much from the start of training camp right through to the end. And it was fitting, I think, that they became a family and they were able to celebrate it as a family together. Even if it was on the road in Val-d'Or, I think it was something special that they'd worked so hard for, and it was amazing. It was wonderful to just see that sheer joy.
You mentioned earlier the original Maineiacs on that team, the guys that were the three remaining on that team that were with the team when the team moved to Lewiston.
Right.
Marc-Andre Cliche, Chad Denny, Pierre-Luc Faubert, picks 1, 2, and 3 in that draft. Mm-hmm. That draft was in Val-d'Or.
Yes, it was.
That went completely full circle for them.
Yes, it did.
And they're the only three on that team that can say that, because they were the only three who were original Maineiacs, who were still on that team, that had seen all 4 years through, and won a cup with that team. It was just incredible thing to see. And then of course afterwards, everybody's celebrating on the ice. You get and you're stuck up in the booth,
right?
Jeff. You're stuck. You've got a broadcast. You've got a game to wrap up. You've got a sponsored segment to do. You've got all this to do.
Yeah, and of course we had an extended post game, obviously, after they won, because we have to.
Sure. And so everybody's celebrating, and all of a sudden, people start filing back to the locker room or whatever, and the cup disappears.
Right.
Where'd that go, Jeff?
It ended up in my booth, which I didn't know was happening. I'd set up to do interviews with guys before the day, or before earlier that day, like morning skate, in case they won, and setting up this post game show. I interviewed Mark Just pregame. He came up after, of course, and was the jubilant guy that he was. Almost in tears still from winning that championship. And then a couple of the players were there to be interviewed that Ed Harding helped me grab, and he grabbed 2 English speakers, thankfully.
So it was Chris Tutalo, I think, was on the air with you at the time.
That's correct, and he was the second one who'd been on air with me. Stefano Gigliotti was first, and Tutalo was on air with me. And I could see Ron Morin, the team's photographer, taking pictures of me interviewing Chris on the air, and I could see him taking pictures of some other things. And little did I know, Ed Harding was standing behind me with the President's Cup, and he then put it down on the table next to me, and I believe my expression on the air was, "Oh my God, they just brought the cup up here." It was just completely surprised reaction, and I kept trying. So I finished the interview with Chris, and they tried to have me hold up the cup. The people that were still on the ice, of course, for people who know me, I'm pretty scrawny. So that thing was a little bit too heavy for me to lift over my head, so I just kind of put my hand on it.
You say that. I'm pretty sure there exists visual evidence somewhere of you lifting the cup later on that afternoon.
That is correct.
Just to be fair.
Yes, there is.
Just to be fair. But so that was a great moment for you, but also for the Twin Cities, for the Lewiston Auburn hockey community. For the Maineiacs themselves. It wasn't the end of the season, of course. Mm-hmm. The team went on to play in the Memorial Cup, won their first game. Lost the second in heartbreaking fashion.
Yes.
After a goal that probably should have counted was disallowed.
Right.
If I remember that correctly. That whole trip was a blur to a lot of people, myself included. Mm-hmm. But I seem to remember that part of it.
I think that was the next game. I think that was the Plymouth game.
That was okay.
Yeah,
so
that was the Plymouth game.
So they lost the set. They lost 2 games.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately meant they had to play Plymouth again in
an
if game. And by that point, the injuries that they'd avoided all season long.
Yeah.
Bernier couldn't play anymore. He was toast. Cliche couldn't play anymore. He was toast. There were other guys that were playing hobbled. Mm-hmm. The injury bug that they'd avoided all season long hit them at the wrong time.
Right.
In that case. That doesn't diminish anything that happened, though, really. I mean, no. you look at the way this team finished the season, and after they won their last 10 games of the season, then they win 16 out of 17 in the playoffs. So they won 26 out of 27 games. that's a heck of a run by anybody at any level to
Right.
win 26 out of 27 games. And then 27 out of 28 if you count that first game of the Memorial Cup.
Right.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing to watch the team work as much as it did. And, you know, there were moments during that playoff run when I said to myself, I remember in particular Game 3 in Halifax. They were behind going into the third period. And my first thought as soon as I signed off, you know, at the end of the second period to go to the break was, wonder how they're going to find a way to pull this one out. That was literally my first thought, is wonder how they're going to find a way to pull this one out. And it turned out 2 Stephane Chaput goals, and there it was. But that sort of storyline played out so often. I was a little bit surprised when it didn't in the Memorial Cup, but you could tell, too, that the injuries were mounting. Marc-Andre Cliche got hurt in the first game, couldn't play again. Bernier was standing on his head but wasn't getting much help. They couldn't generate much offense. They were playing teams that were constructed a little differently than they had been in the past. The team they lost to in the second game, the Vancouver Giants, was a big, strong team led by Milan Lucic.
Right.
We all know who he is in these parts. Kendall McCardle, who was a very good player, who I ended up getting to know when he was a member of the Portland Pirates a few years ago, was on that team. And they were a big, strong, tough team playing on their home rink, and they ended up winning the Memorial Cup eventually.
Sure. And you know, you look at Plymouth, had 8 guys on it that have had at least a cup of coffee in the NHL.
And they were another big, strong,
100%.
tough team.
James Neal
Yes.
was on that team.
Yes, he was.
Just to give you an idea. I mean, and he wasn't their leading scorer.
Right. Jared Bowl was on that team, too.
Sure was. Brophy.
Michael Neuver was on that team.
Evan Brophy.
Yep.
So there was some quality opponents out there. Jeff, your lasting impressions of this season, this 2006-2007 team, because of course you were among those who moved on after the season as well, as was Clem.
Yep.
Eric Castonguay could possibly have come back for his 20-year-old year, elected to go and play professional. Chad Denny went and played professionally as a 20-year-old. Some of these guys, Gigliotti and Chaput came back, but that was the end of the road for a lot of those guys as a unit. What do you remember the most about that whole run?
That there was always excitement, but there was always focus with that group. They had fun, but they knew when it was time to stop having fun and go to work, which is not an easy thing sometimes in major junior hockey because you're dealing with teenagers after all. But that group cared about one another. That group cared about what they were doing together. That group cared about their coaching staff, even though there was always, little things between everybody. That's what happens within a team. But they never let any of those things overshadow the goal. And everybody that I came across with that group was a great person. That there isn't a single person within that group that I would say was a bad kid. They were all good kids, and that's what made you root for them so much, was they were all good kids. You wanted to root for them, and it was exciting to be a part of it. I'm just, not every broadcaster gets to be a part of a team that does something special like that 06-07 Maineiacs teams did. So it always, for me, will be a memory that I'm going to cherish, and I'm just so thankful that I was part of that group. I'm thankful that, especially for this community that as I've said, I live here now, and I've kind of adopted as my hometown. I'm happy that I have my own little piece of describing what many would say is maybe the greatest hockey achievement in Lewiston, Auburn ever. And it's humbling to me to be a part of that, knowing what hockey means to this area. And, growing up in Maine and not being from here but now living here, knowing how important the sport is and what this community is all about, to me is very humbling to be even a small part of that.
Jeff Mannix, thank you very much. We hope that everybody listening has enjoyed this trip down memory lane with the broadcaster of the Lewiston Maineiacs for 3 seasons, 2004-05 through 2006-07 inclusive. Jeff was a big part of that team in terms of making sure we all knew what was going on with that team on the radio throughout his 3 years, and we thank you for your time very much. It's been a pleasure, as always.
My pleasure, Justin. Pleasure to do it and to talk to you again, my good friend.
And we thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure recounting this as well. I'm Justin Pelletier here with the Sun Journal and Sun Media Group. Hope to talk to you again soon.